Barron Trump walked into the room, and something incredible was about to unfold. Something so amazing, so jaw-dropping, it would become the greatest showdown of wits anyone had ever witnessed. It was late afternoon at an exclusive charity gala in Palm Beach, Florida, the kind of event where the air buzzed with wealth, power, and the faint hum of whispered gossip. The crowd was a mix of polished elites, business moguls, socialites, and a few curious onlookers sipping overpriced champagne. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the marble floors, and the mood was relaxed, almost sleepy. People adjusted their designer suits, flipped through auction pamphlets, and exchanged polite smiles. Nobody expected the night to turn into a battlefield. Then Barron stepped in. Tall, lean, and strikingly composed for his age, the youngest Trump carried himself with an effortless calm. He wore a tailored black blazer over a crisp white shirt, no tie, and dark jeans, casual yet sharp. A small leather bag hung over his shoulder, and his blonde hair was neatly swept back. At first, he blended into the crowd, just another young face among the sea of privilege. But then eyes started to catch him. A few heads turned, recognition flickering across their faces. Whispers rippled through the room. Was that really him? The son of the former president. Some stared openly, others pretended not to notice, but the energy shifted. Barron, unfazed, made his way to a corner table near a massive window overlooking the ocean, settling into a cushioned chair with a view. He pulled out his phone, his expression neutral, almost bored, like someone used to being watched but indifferent to it. Across the room, a man in his early 40s noticed him too. This wasn't just any guest. This was a self-proclaimed Zelensky superfan, a loud, brash figure known for his outspoken admiration of the Ukrainian leader. He wore a garish blue and yellow pin on his lapel, a nod to Ukraine's flag, and his dark hair was slicked back with too much gel. His suit was loud, his demeanor louder. He'd spent the evening cornering people, ranting about Zelensky's courage, his defiance, his moral superiority, especially when it came to that infamous Trump phone call years ago. To him, the Trumps were the enemy, a symbol of everything he despised. And now here was Barron, practically gift-wrapped for his scorn. The Zelensky fans' eyes narrowed, locking onto something around Barron's wrist, a simple leather bracelet, worn and slightly frayed, with a small metal charm dangling from it. It looked out of place on someone like him, someone born into billions. The Zelensky fan didn't hesitate. He strode across the room, his polished shoes clicking against the marble, radiating a smug confidence. He stopped a few feet from Barron's table, just close enough for his voice to carry. "Seriously," he said, loud enough to turn heads. "That thing looks like it came from a thrift store reject pile." A few guests glanced up, some smirking, others shifting awkwardly. The man's tone dripped with condescension, his lips curling into a smirk as he crossed his arms. Didn't expect a Trump to accessorize like a broke college kid. The room grew quieter, the hum of conversation fading as people tuned in. A woman in a red dress nearby stifled a laugh, while an older man at the bar raised an eyebrow, sipping his drink. Barron didn't react. He kept scrolling on his phone, his face as still as stone. Did he even hear it? The Zelensky fan wasn't done. He took a step closer, emboldened by the lack of response. "What's next, Barron? A Zelensky t-shirt to match. Oh wait, you'd probably burn it first." The jab was sharp, laced with venom, a clear shot at the Trump-Zelensky tension that still lingered in political circles. A few people gasped softly, others exchanged looks. Things were getting spicy. The Zelensky fan grinned, feeding off the attention, convinced he'd scored a point. But Barron stayed silent, his fingers moving lazily over his screen. That silence, it unnerved the man. He expected a comeback, a flustered retort, anything. Instead, he got nothing. He scoffed, loud and theatrical, and turned away, heading toward the bar as if he'd won. The crowd murmured, some amused, some uncomfortable, but all curious. The tension hung there, thick and electric. The Zelensky fan thought he'd humiliated Barron, thought he'd walked away the victor in this little public spat. He was wrong. Something was brewing, something bigger than he could have imagined. The bracelet wasn't just some random trinket, it held a story, a secret that would soon turn this smug loudmouth into the night's biggest fool. The room didn't know it yet, But Barron Trump was about to flip the script in the most spectacular way possible. Charity Gala was now a simmering pot of intrigue, the air crackling with anticipation after the Zelensky fans' bold opening strike. The man leaned against the bar, swirling a glass of whiskey, his smirk still plastered across his face. He thought he'd landed a knockout punch, humiliating Barron Trump in front of Palm Beach's elite. Guests milled around, some pretending to focus on the auction items, gold watches, signed memorabilia, a yacht getaway, but their eyes kept darting back to Barron's table. The young Trump sat there, still as a statue, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. His calm was maddening, almost taunting. The Zelensky fan couldn't stand it. He turned to a cluster of people nearby, raising his voice again. "I mean, come on," he said, gesturing toward Barron with his glass. "A billionaire's kid wearing something my dog wouldn't chew on. Guess money can't buy taste." The crowd tittered, some laughed, some winced, but the man soaked it up, his ego swelling. He adjusted his blue and yellow pin, a badge of his Zelensky obsession, and kept going. "Maybe it's a protest piece. What's the message, kid? I'm too rich to care." His tone was biting, laced with that same Trump-hatting bile he'd been spewing all night. A woman in a sequined gown smirked, whispering to her date, while a gray-haired man in a tuxedo frowned, sensing the line being crossed. Barron didn't flinch. He set his phone down slowly, deliberately, and reached into his leather bag. Out came a small notebook, nothing fancy, just a plain, weathered thing with a cracked spine. He flipped it open, revealing pages of handwritten notes in tight, precise script. The move was so ordinary, so out of place in this high-stakes drama that it threw people off. A man in his 50s, seated at a table nearby, noticed. He wore a crisp navy suit, his silver hair catching the chandelier light, and carried the air of someone who'd seen 1,000 power plays. "Didn't peg you for the analog type," he said to Barron, his voice low but friendly. Barron glanced at him, his blue eyes cool and steady. "Not everything needs a screen," he replied simply, turning a page. The man chuckled, impressed. "Fair enough." But the Zelensky fan wasn't laughing. From the bar, he watched Barron with growing irritation. That bracelet still bugged him, its simplicity, its defiance of everything he assumed about the Trumps. He muttered to a bartender, loud enough to carry, "Bet he got it from some gas station on the way here. Typical." The bartender, a young guy with a nervous smile, nodded vaguely, clearly uninterested in the drama. The Zelensky fan wasn't letting it go. He sauntered back toward Barron's table, slower this time, his voice rising with mock curiosity. "So what's the deal, Barron? That thing's supposed to impress us, or are you just slumming it for fun?" The room tensed. A woman in an emerald dress paused mid-sip, her eyes widening. The gray-haired man in the tuxedo leaned forward slightly, sensing a shift. Barron finally looked up, not at the Zelensky fan, but at the bracelet itself. His fingers brushed the leather, lingering on the small metal charm. Then he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, not a triumphant one, just a small, knowing curve of his lips. And that smile, it was a match to a powder keg. The Zelensky fan froze, his confidence flickering. He wanted a reaction, but this wasn't what he'd bargained for. A voice cut through the silence, sharp and clear. "That's not just any bracelet." It came from a woman near the front of the room, maybe in her late 60s, dressed in a sleek black dress with pearl earrings. She turned in her chair, her gaze locking onto the Zelensky fan before sliding to Barron. "I've seen something like it before, years ago." Her tone was steady, authoritative, the kind that made people listen. The Zelensky fan raised an eyebrow, scoffing. "Oh, please. What, it's some rare artifact now?" The woman ignored him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's handmade, one of a kind. You don't find those in stores, and it's not cheap." The room leaned in. The gala hadn't even hit its main event, and this was already better than anything on the auction block. Barron stayed quiet, letting the words sink in, his fingers still resting on the bracelet. The Zelensky fan crossed his arms, forcing a laugh. "Okay, fine, so it's a fancy little trinket. Big deal." But his bravado was cracking, he could feel it slipping. The navy-suited man nearby spoke up again, his voice softer but firm. "It's not about fancy," he said, glancing at Barron. "It's personal." The Zelensky fan's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to fire back, but Barron's voice stopped him cold. "I don't wear things for people like you," he said, calm and cutting, his eyes finally meeting the man. "I wear them because they mean something to me." The words landed like a slap, simple but heavy. The woman in black nodded slowly, as if she'd known all along. "It's from Slovenia, isn't it?" she asked, her voice softening. Barron's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gaze. The Zelensky fan blinked, thrown off. Slovenia? What did that have to do with anything? The truth was coming, and it was about to hit harder than anyone expected. The Palm Beach Gala was now a full-blown spectacle, every eye glued to the unfolding drama between Barron Trump and the Zelensky fan. The room buzzed with a strange energy, part curiosity, part unease, as the woman in black's words hung in the air. Slovenia. The mention of Barron's mother Melania's homeland sent a ripple through the crowd. The Zelensky fan stood there, arms still crossed, but his smirk was gone, replaced by a twitch of uncertainty. He walked into this thinking he'd own the night, but the ground was shifting beneath him. Barron leaned back in his chair, his fingers grazing the bracelet again. The leather was worn, the metal charm scratched and dull, but he held it with a quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller. The woman in black tilted her head, her pearl earrings glinting as she spoke. "I met a craftsman in Ljubljana once," she said, her voice steady but tinged with memory. "Years ago. He made pieces like that, simple but with stories carved into them." A murmur spread through the guests. Ljubljana, Slovenia's capital. Melania Trump's roots. The connection was clicking into place, and it was deliciously unexpected. The Zelensky fan tried to laugh it off. "What, so it's some artsy souvenir? That's supposed to impress me." His voice was loud, but it cracked at the edges. The navy-suited man nearby exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "It's not about impressing you," he said, his tone low and pointed. "It's about what it means." Barron finally spoke again, his voice soft but piercing. "It was a gift," he said, his blue eyes locking onto the Zelensky fan. The room went still. Even the clink of champagne glasses faded as people leaned in, hungry for more. "A gift," the Zelensky fan snorted, clinging to his bravado. "From who? Some tourist trap vendor?" Barron didn't rise to the bait. He took a slow breath, his thumb pressing against the charm. "From a man named Marco," he said, his voice even, almost reverent. "He worked for my family when I was a kid, back in Slovenia before we moved full-time to the States." The crowd exchanged glances. What? This wasn't the flashy Trump tale they'd expected. Barron kept going, his words deliberate. "He was a carpenter, fixed things around the house my mom grew up in. He didn't have much, lived in a little place down the road, but he made things. Beautiful things. Tables, chairs, little carvings." The Zelensky fan blinked, his mouth opening then closing. He didn't know what to do with this. The woman in black nodded almost to herself. "I thought so," she murmured. "That charm, it's got that Slavic knot pattern, old-school craftsmanship." Barron glanced at her, then back at the bracelet. "He gave it to me when I was 9, he continued. "Right before we left for good. Said he made it from a piece of wood he'd salvaged from my mom's old porch swing. Told me it was a reminder to never forget where I came from." Silence that followed was thick, heavy with meaning. The Zelensky fan's face flushed. He'd mocked something sacred, something tied to Barron's roots, his mother, his identity. The woman in the sequin gown from earlier bit her lip, her smirk gone. The gray-haired man in the tuxedo sat back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The navy-suited man spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "People always think value about money," he said. "That's where they trip up." Barron gave a small nod, barely perceptible. "That's the mistake," he said, his eyes still on the Zelensky fan. The man squirmed. His whole shtick, his loud Zelensky-worshipping, Trump-bashing persona was crumbling. He tried to paint Barron as a spoiled brat, a shallow, rich kid, but this was raw, real, and it hit harder than any comeback he could have dreamed up. He cleared his throat, scrambling for a lifeline. "Okay, fine," he said, his voice tighter now. "It's a nice story, doesn't change who you are." Barron's gaze didn't waver. "You don't know who I am," he said, calm but cold. "You saw a name and a bracelet and thought you had me figured out. You didn't." The room felt like it was holding its breath. The Zelensky fan's jaw tightened. He hated this, hated being called out, especially in front of this crowd. But Barron wasn't done. "You judged something you didn't understand," he said, his voice steady as steel. "That's on you." The words weren't loud, weren't angry, they didn't need to be. They cut deeper than any shout. The woman in black folded her hands, watching with a faint, satisfied smile. The navy-suited man leaned back, crossing his arms, letting the moment play out. The Zelensky fan opened his mouth, desperate to claw back some control. "I didn't mean," he started, but Barron cut him off. "Yeah, you did," he said, his tone flat and final. The man faltered, his arms dropping to his sides. He walked in here thinking he'd humiliate Baron Trump, thinking he'd score points with his righteous Zelensky fandom. Instead, he'd stepped on a landmine of meaning and blown himself up. The crowd knew it. He knew it. And Barron. He just leaned back in his chair, the bracelet resting against his wrist, a quiet symbol of everything the Zelensky fan had misjudged. The night wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and it was about to get even wilder. The Palm Beach Charity Gala had transformed into a pressure cooker, the air thick with the aftermath of Baron Trump's quiet but devastating takedown of the Zelensky Superfan. The room, once a playground for casual chatter and clinking glasses, now pulsed with a raw, unspoken energy. Guests stood frozen, caught between fascination and discomfort, their eyes darting between Barron, still seated calmly by the window, and the Zelensky fan, who looked like a man who just stumbled into quicksand and didn't know how to climb out. The bracelet, that simple leather strap with its scratched metal charm, had become the night's unlikely star, a symbol that had flipped the script and left everyone reeling. The Zelensky fan stood there, his arms limp, his blue and yellow pin glinting mockingly under the chandelier light. His attempt to humiliate Barron had backfired so spectacularly that the smugness he'd worn like armor all night was now a tattered rag. He tried to speak, to brush off Barron's words with a weak "I didn't mean." But the young Trump's icy "yeah, you did" had shut him down cold. The crowd felt it, the sting of truth, the weight of Barron's calm authority. The woman in the sleek black dress with pearl earrings watched with a faint, knowing nod, her earlier revelation about the bracelet's Slovenian origin still echoing in the room. The navy-suited man nearby sipped his drink slowly, his silver hair catching the light as he murmured to no one in particular, "That's how you lose a fight you didn't even need to start." But the Zelensky fan wasn't ready to slink away, not yet. His pride, battered as it was, clawed for a foothold. He forced a laugh louder than necessary and turned to the crowd, trying to rally them back to his side. "Okay, sure," he said, his voice straining to sound casual. "It's a cute little story. Kid gets a bracelet from some old guy in Slovenia. Real tearjerker. Doesn't mean it's worth anything." He waved a hand dismissively, as if he could erase the moment with sheer bravado. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to indulge him or let him dig his own grave. The woman in the sequined gown from earlier smirked again, but it was thinner now, less certain. Barron didn't bite. He sat there, his blue eyes steady, his fingers resting lightly on the notebook he'd pulled out earlier. The leather bracelet hung loosely on his wrist, its quiet presence louder than any words the Zelensky fan could muster. The gray-haired man in the tuxedo, seated a few tables away, leaned forward, his voice cutting through the awkward silence. "You're missing the point," he said, his tone dry but firm. "It's not about what it's worth to you, it's about what it's worth to him." The Zelensky fan's head snapped toward him, his jaw tightening. "Oh, come on," he shot back. "Spare me the sentimentality. This is a Trump we're talking about, everything's a prop." That was a mistake. The room bristled, calling Barron a prop, a shallow extension of his family name, lit a spark in the already charged atmosphere. The woman in black raised an eyebrow, her pearl earrings glinting as she tilted her head. "A prop," she said, her voice soft but sharp. "You think a boy keeps something like that for 20 years just to play a part?" Her words were a dagger, precise and unrelenting. The Zelensky fan flinched, his bravado cracking further. He opened his mouth to argue, but Barron's voice cut through again, low and deliberate. "You don't get it," he said, his gaze locking onto the man. "You think this is about money or status. It's not." The Zelensky fan froze, caught off guard by the intensity in Barron's stare. The young Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried across the room. "Marco didn't give me this because I was a Trump," he said. "He gave it to me because I was a kid who listened. A kid who sat with him while he worked, who asked him about the wood, the tools, the stories. He didn't care about my last name. He cared about who I was." The words landed like a thunderclap, heavy with a truth the Zelensky fan couldn't twist. The crowd was riveted. Some leaned forward, others held their breath. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a window into something deeper, something human that defied the caricature the Zelensky fan had tried to paint. The navy-suited man set his glass down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's the thing about value," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "It's not always in the price tag, sometimes it's in the memory." The Zelensky fan's face flushed red. He was losing the room, and he knew it. He tried to pivot, grasping at straws. "Fine," he said, his tone sharper now. "So it's a precious little keepsake. Doesn't change what your family stands for. Zelensky's a hero. Your dad tried to smear him, and you're sitting here acting like some saint with a sob story." The mention of Zelensky, and by extension the Trump-Zelensky feud, sent a jolt through the crowd. It was a cheap shot, a desperate attempt to drag politics into the mix and reclaim his footing. But Barron didn't flinch. "This isn't about my dad," he said, his voice steady as steel. "And it's not about your hero. It's about you, and the fact that you saw something you didn't understand and decided to tear it down." The Zelensky fan's eyes widened, his mouth opening then closing like a fish out of water. Barron leaned back, his point made, his calm unshaken. The woman in black folded her hands, her gaze piercing as she watched the Zelensky fan squirm. "You misjudged," she said simply, echoing Barron's earlier words. The gray-haired man in the tuxedo nodded, adding, "Most people do." The Zelensky fan stood there exposed, his loudmouth persona stripped bare. He'd come for a fight, but he'd gotten a lesson, one he couldn't laugh off. And the night was far from over. The gala was now a full-on crucible, the tension so thick you could slice it with a butter knife. The Zelensky Superfan stood there, marooned in the middle of the room, his blue and yellow pin looking more like a target than a badge of honor. He tried to claw back control, throwing out barbs about Barron's family and Zelensky's heroism, but it was like tossing pebbles at a tank. Barron Trump remained unmoved, his quiet strength turning the man's every word into dust. The crowd was no longer on the fence. They were hooked, leaning into this slow-motion train wreck with a mix of awe and second-hand embarrassment. Barron sat by the window, his leather bracelet catching the faint glow of the chandelier, its simplicity a stark contrast to the Zelensky fan's overblown bravado. The young Trump's last words, "You saw something you didn't understand and decided to tear it down," still echoed, a verbal gut punch that had left the man reeling. The navy-suited man nearby swirled his drink, his silver hair gleaming as he watched the scene unfold with a quiet satisfaction. The woman in black, her pearl earrings shimmering, kept her eyes on the Zelensky fan, her earlier calm now edged with something like pity. The gray-haired man in the tuxedo leaned back, his faint smile growing. He'd seen egos crumble before, but this was a masterclass. The Zelensky fan couldn't take it anymore. His pride, battered and bleeding, demanded one last stand. He straightened up, forcing a grin that looked more like a grimace, and turned to the crowd again. "All right," he said, his voice loud but shaky. "So the kid's got a sentimental streak. Big whoop. Doesn't make him some deep thinker. He's still a Trump born with a silver spoon, probably never worked a day in his life. That bracelet, it's a prop for sympathy, nothing more." He jabbed a finger toward Barron, his tone dripping with defiance. "You don't get to play humble with me, kid. I know your type." The room bristled again. The woman in the sequin gown gasped softly, her hand fluttering to her chest. A few guests exchanged looks. Was this guy serious? The navy-suited man set his glass down hard, the clink cutting through the murmurs. "You're doubling down," he said, his voice low but incredulous. "After all that?" The Zelensky fan shot him a glare. "Yeah, I am," he snapped. "This isn't some fairy tale. He's not some misunderstood poet. He's a rich brat with a sob story." Barron didn't react, not at first. He just sat there, his blue eyes fixed on the Zelensky fan, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice so calm it was almost chilling. "You don't know my type," he said. "You don't know me at all." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the room feel smaller. The Zelensky fan scoffed, but it was weaker now, less sure. "Oh, please," he said. "Spare me the mystery act. You're a trump, everything's handed to you. That bracelet doesn't change that." That's when the woman in black intervened again. She stood up slowly, her sleek dress rustling as she rose, her presence commanding silence. "You're wrong," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "That bracelet changes everything because it's not about what he was given, it's about what he kept." She paused, letting the words sink in, then turned to Barron. "Marco, you said the carpenter." Barron nodded once, his fingers brushing the charm again. "Yeah," he said softly. "Marco." The woman's eyes softened, a flicker of memory crossing her face. "I knew a Marco once," she said. "In Ljubljana, worked with my uncle for years. Rough hands, quiet voice, made things that lasted, things people didn't always appreciate until later." She looked back at the Zelensky fan, her gaze hardening. "You mocked something you couldn't possibly understand. That's not Barron's failing, it's yours." The crowd murmured, a wave of agreement rippling through them. The gray-haired man in the tuxedo nodded slowly. "She's right," he said. "You saw a target, he saw a memory." The Zelensky fan's face twisted. He was cornered and he hated it. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his voice rising. "You're all eating this up like it's some profound revelation. It's a bracelet, a lousy piece of leather. I don't care who made it, it's not worth this." But his words were hollow and the room knew it. Barron leaned forward, his voice steady but edged with something new, resolve. "It's worth more to me than anything you'll ever understand," he said. "Not because it's leather or wood or metal. Because it's a piece of someone who mattered. Someone who saw me. Not my name, not my family, just me." The Zelensky fan stared at him, his bravado crumbling into dust. The navy-suited man spoke up again, his tone dry but cutting. "You wanted to humiliate him," he said. "Instead, you showed everyone who you really are." The woman in the sequin gown nodded, her earlier amusement replaced by something closer to respect. The gray-haired man in the tuxedo added, "And who he is." The Zelensky fan's hands clenched into fists, his face a mask of frustration and shame. He'd come here to take Barron down, to flex his Zelensky-fueled righteousness, but he'd miscalculated, badly. Barron didn't gloat, he didn't need to. He just sat there, the bracelet resting against his wrist, a quiet testament to everything the Zelensky fan had gotten wrong. The crowd was shifting now, their whispers growing louder, their stares more pointed. The Zelensky fan felt it, the weight of their judgment, the sting of his own defeat. He turned away, muttering something under his breath, and headed for the bar again, his shoulders slumped. But this wasn't the end, not yet. The night had one more twist, and it would leave everyone speechless. The Palm Beach Gala had reached its boiling point, the air electric with the wreckage of the Zelensky Superfan's failed crusade against Barron Trump. The room, once a glittering showcase of wealth and small talk, was now a coliseum, a stage where pride had clashed with meaning, and meaning had won. The Zelensky fan stood by the bar, his glass trembling slightly in his hand, his blue and yellow pin a faded echo of the confidence he'd strutted in with. He tried everything, mockery, insults, desperate jabs at Barron's family, and it had all collapsed around him, leaving him exposed as the night's biggest loser. The crowd watched, their whispers a chorus of judgment, their eyes flicking between him and Barron, who sat by the window like a quiet king on a throne of his own making. The bracelet, that worn leather strap with its scratched metal charm, had become the centerpiece of this unexpected saga, a symbol that had turned the Zelensky fan's smug attack into a humiliating self-inflicted wound. Barron's last words, "It's worth more to me than anything you'll ever understand," still lingered, a quiet bombshell that had stripped the man bare. The woman in the sleek black dress with pearl earrings stood near her chair, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos. The navy-suited man sipped his drink, his silver hair catching the light as he watched with a faint, satisfied smirk. The gray-haired man in the tuxedo leaned back, his arms crossed, his faint smile now a full-on grin. He'd seen egos fall, but this was a demolition for the ages. The Zelensky fan couldn't let it go. His pride, shredded as it was, refused to surrender. He slammed his glass down on the bar, the sharp clink drawing every eye back to him. "This is insane," he said, his voice loud and raw, teetering on the edge of desperation. "You're all acting like this kid's some philosopher because of a stupid bracelet. It's not deep, it's not profound, it's a prop and you're all falling for it." He gestured wildly at Barron, his face red, his gelled hair starting to loosen from its slick prison. "He's a trump. He's not some humble everyman. He's playing you, and you're too blind to see it." The room tensed. A few guests winced. This was getting ugly. The woman in the sequin gown from earlier clutched her date's arm, her eyes wide. The navy-suited man raised an eyebrow, setting his glass down slowly. "You're still going," he said, his tone dry but laced with disbelief. "After all that?" The Zelensky fan ignored him, his gaze locked on Barron. "Come on, kid," he said, his voice rising. "Admit it, this is all a game. You don't care about some carpenter. You're just spinning a story to look good." "Tell them." Barron didn't move, not at first. He sat there, his blue eyes steady, his fingers resting lightly on the notebook in front of him. The bracelet hung on his wrist, its quiet presence a rebuke to every word the Zelensky fan spat. Then he stood up. The motion was slow, deliberate, and it silenced the room like a gunshot. He was tall, taller than most realized, and his presence filled the space in a way that made the Zelensky fan take a half step back. "You want the truth," Barron said, his voice low but resonant, carrying to every corner of the gala. "Here it is." The crowd held its breath. The woman in black tilted her head, her pearl earrings glinting as she watched. The gray-haired man in the tuxedo uncrossed his arms, leaning forward. Barron took a step closer to the Zelensky fan, his eyes never wavering. "Marco wasn't just some carpenter," he said. "He was the guy who taught me what work looks like. Real work, not boardrooms, not deals, but hands in the dirt, sweat on your face. He'd spend hours fixing things my mom's family couldn't afford to replace, chairs, doors, that porch swing. He didn't do it for money. He barely got paid. He did it because it mattered." The Zelensky fan opened his mouth, but Barron kept going, his voice rising just enough to drown him out. "I was 9 when he gave me this," he said, lifting his wrist so the bracelet caught the light. 9 years old, sitting on a dusty porch in Slovenia, watching him carve this knot into a piece of wood he'd saved from the trash. He didn't have to give me anything. He didn't owe me a damn thing. But he did. And you know what he said? Barron paused, his gaze boring into the Zelensky fan. He said, "Don't let the world make you forget who you are. Not my name, not my family, who I am." The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. The Zelensky fan's face twisted. He wanted to argue, to lash out, but there was nothing left to grab onto. Barron took another step forward, his voice steady but fierce. "You think this is a prop," he said. "You think I'd wear this for 20 years just to impress people like you. This isn't about my dad or Zelensky or any of your politics. This is about a man who saw something in me when I was just a kid, and you don't get to take that away." The navy-suited man nodded slowly, his voice cutting through the hush. "That's what you missed," he said to the Zelensky fan. "You saw a target, he saw a legacy." The woman in black stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the marble. "You humiliated yourself," she said, her tone calm but final. "Not him." The gray-haired man in the tuxedo stood up now, his grin fatting into something more serious. "You picked the wrong fight," he said, "and the wrong guy." The Zelensky fan staggered back, his bravado gone, his face a mask of defeat. The crowd erupted into murmurs, some shaking their heads, others whispering in awe. He turned away, his shoulders slumped, and shuffled toward the exit, the blue and yellow pin a sad footnote to his collapse. Barron watched him go, then sat back down, the bracelet resting against his wrist like a quiet victory. The gala resumed, music started, glasses clinked again, but no one would forget this. As the night wound down, the woman in black approached Barron's table. "Marco would have been proud," she said softly. Barron looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I hope so," he said. The navy-suited man raised his glass from across the room, a silent toast. The The gray-haired man in the tuxedo nodded once, then turned back to his drink. Outside, the ocean rolled on, indifferent to the drama within. But inside, one truth stood clear. Some things, some people, carry a value no one can diminish, no matter how loud they shout. If you enjoyed this story, check out another video with an even more amazing tale. There's always something exciting waiting for you on our channel. And don't forget, more wonderful stories are coming soon. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our upcoming adventures.